Good evening and welcome to the Savannah Council on World Affairs for our April presentation entitled Russia, Europe, and the United States, the Fragmented Relationship, presented by Savannah Council on World Affairs board member Olavi Arens. Olavi will examine the relations, or lack thereof, between Russia and the West as it has developed from the end of the Cold War and into the current phase of estrangement. My name is Chip O'Brien, current president of the Savannah Council on World Affairs. Before turning the lectern over to Olavi, I wanted to thank you, our friends, members, and sponsors, for your continued support. Because of you, we can bring you these programs and again provide scholarships for both Savannah State and Georgia Southern universities. I want especially to thank our platinum sponsor, Kreitz Auto Group, and all of our sponsors for this year, which you can see on the slide in front of you. I also want to thank the Skidaway Island Presbyterian Church for use of their sanctuary, and Debbie Hornsby for her personal technical help in producing this video. After Olavi's talk and a few questions from our members, I will close with a reminder of our future speakers and World Affairs Council of America offerings. Now I give you Dr. Olavi Arens, a member of the History Department of Georgia Southern, Armstrong campus, and a longtime member of our board of directors. Thank you for agreeing to speak tonight, Olavi.
Thank you, Chip. Greetings, fellow Savannah Council members. I wish the circumstances were different, but what can we do? There is an old adage, Russia is not as strong as it looks. Russia is not as weak as it seems. Russia is territorially the largest country in the world, well over twice the size of the United States. Yet the population of Russia today, at 145 million, is less than half that of the United States. There are two ways of measuring the GDPs of countries and assessing comparatively their economic strengths. One is the nominal GDP calculation that totals up the goods and the services produced by a country and translates the final figures into dollars according to the existing exchange rate at the moment. Both the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund provide tables with these statistics. According to the nominal GDP calculation, the United States is the leading economic power in the world with a GDP in 2019 of $21.4 trillion. China is second with 14.1 trillion, and Russia is 11th with a GDP of $1.6 trillion, below that of Italy and only 7.5% of the US GDP. This is the column to the left, the nominal GDP calculation. Using these statistics, Russian defense expenditures, which amount to about 4% of the GDP total, amount to approximately $60 billion, below that of Italy and equivalent, the defense expenditure equivalent to roughly the French defense budget. Indeed, this is the figure that is usually cited by reputable international institutes in tables listing military expenditures by countries of the world. The most recent example of this is the report issued yesterday by the reputable Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which listed Russia fourth in the world in defense expenditures, behind the United States, China, and India, and slightly above France. Even Putin has used this figure at times when he has found it useful. Of course, he does not really believe that. The view presented by these statistics, Russia with a GDP less than that of Italy and defense expenditures equal to those of France, does not seem terribly threatening. But to what extent does it accord with reality? The second method of calculating GDPs of countries is the purchasing power parity method. This method attempts to correct the nominal GDP figures by taking into account the vagaries of the exchange rates among currencies. It also seeks to take into account that similar or in fact the same product or service can be priced very differently in various countries. There is the famous Big Mac index that the journal Economists features annually. As a result, in the nominal GDP calculations, the same product or service can be overvalued or undervalued. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund publishes both sets of statistics. According to the purchasing power parity statistics, China has the largest economy in the world at $27.3 trillion, and the United States is second, with again the 21.4 trillion. The Russian PPP figure is 4.3 trillion, or over 2.5 times the nominal GDP figure, about 20% of the US figure. Russia appears now as number 6 in the world, almost equal to Germany, the number 5 world economy and the leading economy in Europe. Now, to continue with the statistics, Germany spends 1.3% of its GDP on defense to give us a figure between $50 and $60 billion. But Russia has been spending 4%. Using purchasing power parity statistics, this takes us to $160 billion. Indeed, this is what we should be thinking about as a more realistic figure for Russian military expenditures, $150 to $175 billion, well above that of France, Germany, or Britain, and in the class with China and the United States, the two other major military powers in the world. We should keep in mind that the Russian armaments industry is largely autarkic. It was built up during the Soviet era. Russia does not procure its weaponry on the international armaments market. The armaments industry uses Russian raw materials, low-cost energy, and employs a low-wage Russian labor force. We should also keep in mind that unlike the case with Western militaries, where about 50% of the defense budget goes to cover personnel costs, to pay the salaries of a professional military, the Russian personnel costs are considerably lower, and a greater percentage can go into weapons development and procurement of equipment. Following 8 years of economic growth from the year 2000 to 2008, based in part on rising oil prices, Putin in 2008 embarked on a major program of military modernization. We have now seen 12 years of consistent Russian military buildup as Russia has regained a position as a major military power in the world. This occurred at a time when the militaries in Europe were downsizing, enjoying the peace dividend, and the United States pulled most of its troops out of Europe. Russia can support 4 navies: the Northern Fleet in the Arctic at Murmansk, the Baltic Sea Fleet at Kaliningrad, the Black Sea Fleet at Sevastopol, and the Pacific Fleet at Vladivostok. There is a strategic nuclear weapons command with rocket forces, a sizable air force, and an army with a considerable number of heavy armored units totaling to about 750,000 troops, partly professional, partly conscript. The New START Treaty of 2011 limited the number of nuclear warheads for both the United States and Russia to 1550. That's deployable warheads. As has been shown in Syria, Russia is capable of projecting military power outside its boundaries, although Syria is probably at the outer limits of Russian military capability. What does Russia want? The Soviet Union emerged after World War II as one of 2 superpowers in the world. In the late 1980s, as the Cold War was coming to an end, I remember clearly reading in the New York Times an op-ed piece written by Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Secretary General of the Soviet Communist Party, in which he emphatically rejected the role of a future junior ally to the United States. In other words, he could not envisage the Soviet Union becoming a Japan or Britain or West Germany. In 1991, the Soviet Union disintegrated, with Russia inheriting, as we noted, about 3/4 of the territory and half of the population of the Soviet Union. Even though the 1990s were a rough transitional period for Russia, as the Soviet military pulled out of East Germany and Eastern Europe and downsized from its bloated size, President Yeltsin continued to assert Russia's interests whenever and wherever he could. But what was Russia's place to be in the new world? Russia, of course, could not fit into the European Union, nor for that matter into NATO. Attempts were made to bind Russia to NATO by special agreements. However, the Founding Act of 1998 and the Russia-NATO Act of 2002. These agreements proved unable to resolve the issue of Russia's place in the world. The issue for Russian leaders came to be a demand to be treated equally. What this meant was that Russia wanted to be on an equal footing in decision-making with the United States in NATO and be in a position to veto any NATO action, especially any addition of members. Indeed, in the 1990s, the Russian desire was that the Cold War institutions like NATO should be dissolved in the same way as the Warsaw Pact had dissolved. The ideal institution from the Russian perspective was the United Nations, where Russia inherited the seat of the Soviet Union as its successor state in the Security Council, and had the right to veto any measure it deemed unsuitable. Of course, the right to veto measures the United States deemed vital to its interests was something the United States could not possibly accept. European members of NATO understood this. They could influence US decisions in discussions, but not veto decisions. One of the major issues for Russia came to be the expansion of NATO. All of the Cold War and post-Cold War US presidents were committed to NATO. George H.W. Bush was committed to a unified Germany remaining a member of NATO. Bill Clinton approved the admission of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic into NATO in 1999, despite the opposition of President Yeltsin. And George W. Bush approved the admission of Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia, and the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, in 2004, at a time when the opposition of President Putin was actually somewhat softened by a common stance against terrorism. Croatia and Albania joined during the Obama presidency in 2009, and Montenegro in 2017, and most recently North Macedonia during the Trump presidency. All of the presidents have this record. Madeleine Albright, the US Secretary of State during the Clinton presidency, enunciated a vision of Europe whole and free, with Eastern Europe integrated into NATO and the European Union. Indeed, one can view this process as a successful stabilization and integration of Eastern Europe into European institutions. From a Russian perspective, however, NATO enlargement represented an encroachment into an area that had been part of its sphere of influence. Furthermore, there was a strong sense of betrayal by the United States of what Russians came to regard as a promise not to expand NATO. In fact, there was no written document on any limits to NATO expansion, nor was there much discussion of the topic during the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe in 1989 and the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991. The prime issue in 1990 had been German unification and the status of Germany following unification. President Bush and indeed German Chancellor Kohl at the time insisted on the right of the Germans to decide whether Germany should remain in NATO. Gorbachev, in the end, accepted this. No NATO troops were to be stationed in the eastern part of Germany. However, some verbal assurances apparently were made by Secretary of State James Baker that NATO would not expand into Eastern Europe. At the time in 1990, few thought, certainly neither Gorbachev nor Bush, that in the following year the USSR would disintegrate, something that changed the entire landscape in Eastern Europe. Putin has chosen to identify present Russia as the successor state of Soviet Union and indeed of Tsarist Russia, and along with many Russians has had a hard time accepting some of the changes that have taken place since 1989-91 in the world. We, of course, can explore a might have been, or what is called counterfactual history. We can ask, what if there had been no expansion of NATO or the European Union into Eastern Europe? Would relations between Russia and the United States have been better? I would argue that there is good reason to doubt that. Presumably, Russia would have attempted to establish some measure of control over Eastern Europe. But Russia, after 1991, would have been hard put to have re-established a sphere of control over the region because of its economic weakness. When we evaluate Russia's economic position in the world, aside from oil and gas, we need to pay more attention to the nominal GDP figures which point out the economic weakness of Russia. When my students ask which GDP statistic is correct, I usually tell them both are. They tell you something. Russia can export its military power to Syria, but it does not have the economic means to rebuild Syria. A post-1991 Russia would not have been in a position to have dominated the countries to its west. For the Eastern Europeans, the pull of Western Europe culturally and economically would have been too strong. At the present time, it can be said that the economic stake of Western Europe in Eastern Europe is actually now greater than its stake in Russia. As it stands today, Germany's total trade, imports and exports, with what was formerly Eastern Europe totals $400 billion, far larger than its trade turnover with Russia. So far, oil and gas have been the exception. Poland and Ukraine in 1992 had approximately the same population and per capita GDP. At present, Poland's GDP per capita is 4 times that of Ukraine. Not all of this is due to the fact of Poland having become a member of the European Union and NATO, but belonging to both has given Poland a great deal of stability and confidence. Without the integration into Western institutions, Eastern Europe would very well have been an unstable region of strife and competition between Russia and Western Europe. I find it difficult to imagine that this would have led to a stable US-Russian relations. The events of the year 2014 in the Ukraine were a shock, especially to East Europeans. Suddenly, Putin's Russia emerged as a threat to the sanctity of existing borders in Europe. In fact, the very existence of Ukraine seemed to be in question. Yet to date, Russia has not succeeded in fully annexing any of the former Soviet republics to Russia, and that includes Belarus, even though Putin has tried. So far, Russia has been successful in gaining control of border strips of Moldova, Georgia, and now of Ukraine. Right? Moldova exists between Ukraine and Romania on near the Black Sea. The incursion into Ukraine raised fears, in particular in the Baltic States, of something similar being tried there. Poland and Romania bordering on Russia or Ukraine also felt the alarm. So these are the frontline states, in a sense, facing Russia, bordering Russia in some way or another, or the Ukraine. However, Russia's invasion of Ukraine did lead to NATO reacting. NATO airplanes reinforced NATO's air patrols over the skies in the Baltics. And if we look at the Baltic Sea, right, the Baltic states, I'm referring to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and then, of course, Poland right to the south, very central to Eastern Europe, or what we call East Central Europe. Military analysts at RAND Corporation and elsewhere concluded that the Baltic states represented the most vulnerable part of NATO to a possible Russian attack, due to the fact that they bordered on Russia's western military district with its sizable Russian troop concentrations. Now, the western military district includes Moscow, so it's very much the central area of Russia, and by that simple fact would have the largest troop concentrations on Russian territory. The analysts concluded that in case of a sudden Russian attack, Russian armored units would overwhelm the Baltic defenses before NATO could send in reinforcing troops. The presumed Russian motivation for doing this would be to demonstrate to Europeans that NATO was unable to defend its members, and as a result, NATO would presumably dissolve, and the United States would decouple from Europe. At the Warsaw NATO summit of 2016, a decision was made to station battalion-sized NATO troops into each of the Baltic states and Poland to serve as a tripwire and send a signal to Russia that if indeed there was a Russian incursion, NATO was committed to responding. In 2017, 4 NATO member states committed to serve as lead nations for these battalions and provide the bulk of the troops. Britain in Estonia, what this meant was a battalion sized about 1,200 troops. The British contingent would be around 800, to be supplemented by Dutch, French, Danish troops. Canada, the lead nation in Latvia, Germany, the lead nation in Lithuania, and of course the United States in Poland. The United States has committed more troops to Poland besides the NATO battalion. We may note that 3 of these countries are not members of the European Union. So here is NATO acting. This underlines the importance of NATO for Poland, the Baltic states, as well as Romania and perhaps Bulgaria in the Balkans. Security for these countries means NATO and actually not the European Union. Squadrons of 4 fighter aircraft from rotating NATO member countries continue to patrol the skies over the Baltic states. Regular exercises of Baltic, Polish, and NATO forces are conducted. NATO naval forces have paid visits to the ports on the Baltics, and particularly the ports of the Baltic states. Besides stationing of what are called enhanced forward present troops, the other component of NATO planning involved readying a high readiness task force that could be sent eastward to Poland and the Baltic states in case of need. Troop units in Germany, Britain, Netherlands, and France were designated to be part of this rapid response force. A major component, however, was to come from the United States. Indeed, since 2015, there has been a gradual U.S. force buildup in Europe after the drawdown that began in the Obama administration and has continued in the Trump administration. A major troop exercise, Defender Europe 2020, was planned for this spring, but unfortunately has been partly disrupted by the coronavirus pandemic. The major purpose of Defender Europe was to test troop mobility, to see how long it would take to move an armored division from the United States across the Atlantic and then to danger spots in Europe. There were to be 2 destination points for the troops. One was Norway, to show readiness to defend northern Norway as an answer to increased Russian activity in the Arctic Ocean and the North Atlantic. Now, this would be slightly north of the map that you have been looking at. Norway, a non-EU state, but a NATO member, is vital for North Atlantic security, as well as the increased competition in the Arctic Ocean as the iceberg over the Arctic is melting rapidly. Both Norway and the United States are, after all, Arctic Ocean states. A large-scale NATO exercise was conducted in Norway last year. The exercise this spring, however, was postponed because of the coronavirus crisis. It was decided that it was not worth risking the health of the troops for what, after all, was an exercise. Incidentally, as part of the competition over the Arctic, we have seen increased Russian and Chinese interest in Greenland. The major part of the US force sent to Europe was destined, however, to travel east from ports in the Netherlands and Germany to Poland, and then indeed some units were to go further into the Baltic States. The goal was to determine the time it would take for the forces to arrive and to test the readiness status of roads, bridges, and railroads to allow for the movement of heavy equipment. While some of the initial parts of the exercise, the movement of troops and equipment from the United States to Europe, took place and was indeed tested, the exercises were also cut short and postponed because of the pandemic. Planning, however, for a follow-up exercise in 2021 is well along the way. Along with NATO activity, a build-up and modernization of Baltic and Polish forces continues. All four, as well as Romania and Bulgaria, are among the NATO members, all, as we've said, frontline states, which are spending 2% of their GDP for defense. New imaginative defense strategies by these frontline states are being explored, including the use of drones. Here is a recent headline which indicates where we're going, right? And I cite, Estonian robot fires Javelin missile using Norwegian remote launcher. We are looking at warfare conducted by robots. While no one considers a Russian challenge to NATO in the Baltic at present a realistic scenario, there is agreement that a deterrence force needs to be in place and planning needs to be in place. Russia continues its no-notice snap exercises in the Western Military District. As we've noted before, the one possible motive for a Russian strike would be to destroy NATO by showing that the alliance cannot defend member states. If NATO cannot do that, then presumably the alliance would have lost its credibility and would collapse. The United States would be decoupled from Europe, and Russia would clearly emerge as the dominant military power in the region. The same could be said about Norway and its position on the Arctic and the North Atlantic. If one looked at the Arctic boundary of Norway, it is very close to Murmansk. And indeed, toward the end of the Second World War, Norway, of course, was occupied by German forces in the war. Soviet military attacked the Germans in northern Norway and actually occupied the area for a short period of time before pulling back. But Russia is too weak economically to dominate Europe. Still, the Russian military is exercising to challenge NATO and the United States in the Arctic and North Atlantic, the Baltic Sea, and the Black Sea to show that Russia is a great power. Russia has now decoupled from any notion of being part of the Western world. The identity of Russia has turned to the idea of Eurasia, Russia being a separate power center of its own, with its own interest in the Arctic, with China in East Asia, with India in the south, with the Islamic world or the Middle East and Central Asia, and in the West, its interests with Europe and the United States. Russian foreign policy specialists regard Russia's ability to conduct an independent foreign policy a major achievement of the Putin administration. That Russia emerged from what they regard as a badly handled transition by Gorbachev into a position of a major military power in the world, which is able to conduct an independent foreign policy, is regarded positively. After all, the claim to be able to conduct an independent foreign policy is something that can be claimed only by a few countries. Can Russia translate its military power into political and strategic gains? Putin recently enunciated the goal as a reuniting of much of the Soviet space in some form. To conclude now, there is no grand bargain in the offing, nor are resets in relations realistic. What, however, can be considered are specific issues where the interests of the United States and European countries may intersect with those of Russia. During the Obama administration, one such interest seemed to be Iranian nuclear weapons. Russia participated fully in the negotiations. Recently, we have had a smaller example in an understanding which President Trump negotiated with Putin and the Saudis to cut oil production by 10 million barrels a day. While we will be in a different world when the corona crisis ends, some of the basic issues, finding a place for Russia in the world, will remain for the United States and Europe in dealing with Russia in a traditional Russia-West relationship. Now, possibly some questions.
Thank you, Olavi. We did get a couple of questions in advance from our members, so if you do have the time, let us tackle a couple of those. The first one is, what is the future of NATO after President Macron of France recently pronounced NATO brain dead?
Well, I think my argument in the paper has been that NATO has been able to respond to the Ukrainian crisis in a meaningful fashion. It's not a strident response. There were some who advocated moving heavily armored units, for example, NATO heavily armed units into the Baltic States and Poland, and of course that has not been done. It was a measured response of sending battalion-sized trip wire units into the States, which are not that threatening to Russia. So I've seen NATO responding in a very thoughtful and measured ways. At the same time, I cannot, the other side of Macron, and Macron is very provocative and makes you think, which is useful. the other side of this is Macron, of course, is an advocate of a strategically autonomous Europe. And I'm very skeptical of that, especially in light of the fact of of Brexit, of Britain, the other major military power in Europe. The two states with nuclear weapons are France and the UK, and one of them has now withdrawn from the European Union. That leaves only France, and I think France simply is by itself cannot carry the full load. So I'm sort of skeptical about where Putin is going, or Macron is going with this. And my final note would be, I think part of Macron's calculus was that he could make a deal with Russia. And under the present circumstances, I am very, very skeptical of that. It is not a question of Western countries understanding Russia better. It is not, Russia has to be, it takes two to make a deal. Russia also has to make a basic decision to couple again with the West for that to happen.
Thanks, Olavi. Here's another question. What is the effect of the coronavirus crisis on Russia and Putin's policies?
I think this has been a bad spring for Putin. The two events that he had scheduled, one was a referendum in April, which was to ratify the constitutional changes. Putin has surprised the experts and surprised the world. No one, as in my memory, no one predicted that in 2008 Putin would do what he actually did, switch positions with Medvedev, so that then he could sit out 4 years. The Russian constitution, incidentally, has a provision which prohibits anyone running for president for more than 2 consecutive terms. So he sat out 1 term and then came back and was re-elected president, and now, of course, he's in a 2nd or 4th term. And what Putin did was propose a series of constitutional amendments in January, and then came back a month and a half later with the suggestion that perhaps with these constitutional changes, one could go back to square one in counting the years someone could run for president consecutively. So in other words, opening up the proposition that he could run again next time and for another term after that. This was supposed to go to a referendum in April, and the consensus of experts was that Putin would get what he wanted, that the vote would go his way. He has had to postpone it. I think he still wants a referendum, but it's off. And then the May Day parade, May 9th, the 75th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe, and Putin planned a major show of military, and that has had to be postponed also. So postponing a number of things that he was going to do in the spring. And at the same time, clearly there's going to be an Putin faces 2 issues, the corona crisis and the dramatic drop in oil prices. The Russian budget counted on oil prices remaining in the $40 range in order to balance the budget. Well, the price of oil is well below that. So it's going to be there are going to be fiscal problems that he faces down the road, and the Russian economy is also looking at a deep recession.
I think we have time for one last question. Could you give us your ideas on what is a realistic U.S. policy towards Russia?
I think number one on my list would be to go back and renew the New START Treaty. The New START Treaty was negotiated in 2011. That's, of course, the original START Treaty, and this is limiting nuclear warheads. There was the original one of the 90s, and then a new one was negotiated, and these things take time. 2011 to run for 10 years. So it's going to be up next year. It could be renewed for another 5 years if both sides are willing. Here, I think, is an issue, well, and Russia seems to be signaling that it would be interested in doing that. And equal in negotiating with the United States over nuclear weapons issues. So there is no sort of psychological problem in these negotiations. Now, I realize that there are voices in Washington which basically say, well, in the future, China needs to be brought into these discussions. And it's probably so down the line, but then what my understanding is, China at the present time is not interested in participating. So the result is, if that becomes a precondition and China says no, then there will be no renewal, no discussions, and so on. I think this is an important enough issue. It was there for much of the latter part of the Cold War, and one had years and years of discussions, and eventually they led to something. So that would be number one on my issues, on my list of things that can be realistically perhaps accomplished at the present time. And then I would put in a sort of secondary category other types of confidence-building measures that involve forces, try to prevent accidents from happening along tense borders in Europe. There is still an open sky agreement that does exist, allowing overflight of military installations once a year, visits of military going back and forth to sort of reinforce understandings and present realistic pictures of what actually exists on the other side. So there are a set of realistic, I think, things that one can be thinking about.
Thank you again, Olavi. Have a good evening.
Good evening to everyone.
Thank you again, Olavi, for making this timely presentation. Despite our current circumstances, it is more important than ever to further the mission of the Savannah Council on World Affairs by fostering individual awareness of, broadening community involvement in, and promoting the study of international issues. To that end, next month on May 14th, we will present a second virtual talk entitled Many Faces of Islam by Mohammed Mukhtar, a member of the faculty at Savannah State and also a board member of your council. He will explore the Western perception of what Islam is not, and demystify the misunderstandings and generalizations of the West about Islam. You will get an email shortly with more information. I also want to make sure that our members are aware that we have a full slate of speakers already lined up for the fall, which you can see by visiting our website, savannahcwa.org. Our three spring speakers who were forced to cancel due to the virus have agreed to come back to Savannah in the fall. In addition, in October, Dr. Matthew Kroenig is returning to speak to our members again. Please follow our developments on our website and on our Facebook page. We will continue to send you blast emails with timely information as well, including the many presentations and podcasts facilitated by the World Affairs Council of America and our sister councils across the country, whom I would like to thank for being so proactive during this crisis. And again, thank you for watching this presentation. We'll see you in May and plan to return live in September. In the meantime, please contact me with any concerns and ideas. Above all, stay healthy. Good night.